has been 17 years since the crime of 9/11, one of the worst atrocities in American history. We watched on TV, horrified and in disbelief, as we saw the towers come crumbling down, one after another. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" could be heard from the streets. People gasped in astonishment, seeing the cloud of pulverized towers settling over lower Manhattan, like a macabre snowstorm in September.
Armed with knives, armed with chemical, biological, nuclear weapons. Fanatics, terrorists, September 11th. September 11th, killers, September 11th, terrorists. Terrorists of Al-Qaeda, terrorists, nuclear weapons, terrorists. 9/11, terror, terrorist, evil. September 11th, September 11th. The terrorists, war and danger. September 11th, terrorism, global terrorism, terrorism, terrorists. Terrorists, 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 the terror. Terrorists, terrorists, terrorism. September 11th, global terrorism, terrorists. Terrorism. September 11th, world terrorism, terrorism, September 11th, global terrorism.
Terror was drummed into us as we watched these scenes over and over again on our TV screens all across America. It had its desired effect, a traumatized people clamoring for revenge on those responsible for the attack. We were told it was carried out by a band of 19 Arab terrorists operating under the command of Osama bin Laden from his hideout and cave in faraway Afghanistan. So after hijacking the planes, the terrorists then performed an amazing feat of flying at hundreds of miles per hour right into their targets, World Trade Center towers. It was carried out with such precision that even experienced aviation pilots find it incredibly difficult to believe that a band of Middle East hijackers who failed basic flight training could accomplish this wicked act. The cause of the tower's collapse was attributed to the jet fuel igniting with the crash, resulting in uncontained fires that ultimately weakened the structure's steel columns, causing these famous landmarks and icons of Western capitalism to come down in less than 10 seconds. Sweeping changes have since come about. The Patriot Act, the Department of Homeland Security, and several simultaneous wars still going on in the Middle East. A police atmosphere is felt everywhere now, especially at airports where we are molested as part of TSA procedures. Back then, our government representatives were haggling over the issue of raising the debt limit in order for our nation to pay its bills. Not much has changed since. Under the pretext of 9/11, a band of deep state criminals has seized control of our country. We have been lied to, stripped of our freedom, and thrust into endless wars. Like a thief in the night, an invisible assassin has stabbed us in the back. We have been shamelessly deceived about this crime of the century, the criminals of which are yet to be brought to justice. This is the story of the most diabolical act since the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It is the story of the hijacking of America.
9/11. 9/11 happens. At the time, my wife and I were in Hawaii. We were attending a conference. 3:30 in the morning, I get a phone call. And it's one of my officers. I'd retired by that time. It's one of my officers who had served under me. And she said, "Sir, the United States is at war." I said, "See, what are you talking about?" She said, "Listen to me. Go turn on the television. The United States is at war." I still didn't believe. I go turn on the television. Bingo, I see the towers coming down. I said, "Oh, that's a joke." I switched channels, towers going down. I switched channels, towers going down. I said, "Oh my God." I turned to Rima and I said, "You watch. I guarantee you right now that the information about that attack was in the system and somebody missed it." And that's from my own personal intelligence background. All of my experience after that in the intelligence world tells me that when something that big goes by, somebody missed the information. So I was a believer, absolute believer, that the attack was a terrorist attack, that it was all done by other forces. And after that periods, my wife began to put pieces together, and she said, "I don't think that attack was done by the enemy, the terrorists that you indicated." I said, "You're wrong." She said, "I don't believe it." I said, "You're wrong." And so she began to find bits and pieces of information, and she would present them to me, and I said, no, not my government. My government would not tell a lie like that. And I just disbelieved. I was so ingrained in my belief system that I could not believe, I literally could not believe that anybody but a sort of Arab terrorist could do something like that. And then one day, I saw a picture. It was a photograph of the Pentagon and the hole in the Pentagon. And I looked at it and I said, wow. And then I looked at it again. I said, something's wrong. Something's wrong with this picture. Then I kept looking at it. And then I began to not look at it just at a glance, but to study the photograph itself. What's wrong with this picture? Why is your belly saying, my kinesthetic aspect of my processing system saying something wrong with that picture? Well, there was something wrong. And so I analyzed it not just photographically, I did measurements, I did all kinds of it. I checked the plane, the length of the nose, where the wings were. I did all of the measurements. I took the measurements of the Pentagon, the depth of the destruction in the Pentagon. Conclusion, airplane did not make that hole. I went public at the time. I am the highest ranking officer, I believe, that has ever gone public. That whatever that story was, the official story, was not true. Now, I was very careful to not say what it was because I couldn't prove it. I was careful to say it was not the airplane that did that, because I can prove that it was not the airplane. In the hole, however, was a turbine. Looked like the turbine from a missile. I can't prove that, I don't know, but there was something there that did not look like the engine from an airplane, but did look like a turbine from a missile. Later, I saw another photograph of one of the sensors on the outside of the Pentagon. Now, all of the sensors had been turned off. which is kind of interesting, isn't it? That day, why would all of the sensors around the Pentagon be turned off? Ooh, that's strange. I don't care what the excuse is, that's strange. There happened to be one that apparently did not get turned off, and in that picture, coming in, flying into the Pentagon, you see this object. And it obviously hits the Pentagon. When you look at it, it does not look like an airplane. Later, sometime later, after I'd gone public, that imagery was changed. It had, it got a new suit around it that now looked like an airplane. But when you take the suit off, it looks more like a missile, not like an airplane. Let me go back to the next, I think, very important piece of information. The amount of energy required to melt the girders, the steel in the tower, cannot be gotten to a melt point with the fuel that was in the airplane. Not possible. So any melting did not occur as a result of the hit from the airplane. Point. I call it dot, okay? Dot. When you look at the tower coming down, what you see are at each floor successive puffs of smoke. Puff, 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 all the way down. What are the puffs of smoke coming from? Well, they claim they're from the collapsing floors. No. Those puffs of smoke are controlled demolition. That's exactly what they are, because that's exactly how they work. And so the fact that the airplane hit, it did not cause that collapse of the building. The collapse of the building was caused by controlled demolition. Fact, Building 7, Silverberg, I believe is the name of the owner, was on video, and you could see Building 7, you could literally see it, and there was a fire in Building 7, no doubt about that. No airplane hit it. I assume that the fire came from debris, but I'm not even sure of that. But in the lower right-hand corner of the building was a fire. A very big fire, it didn't appear to be out of control. It certainly was in a small part of the building. But then he is heard on the video, okay? And he says, "Pull it." And then the building collapsed.
I had a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
What does pull it mean? What do the words pull it mean? Let me tell you, that's the order for controlled demolition. That is the phraseology that's used for blowing up something. And that's when Building 7 blew up.
Standing at a location that has come to be known widely across the world simply as Ground Zero. Right behind me is where the Twin Towers had once stood. And currently the area is under renovation in what will become in part a memorial to the some 3,000 victims from over 80 different countries who were murdered on September 11, 2001. Many of us will never forget the images that were broadcast on that tragic day. But largely and widely unknown across the world is the fact that a third building also went down on the morning of September 11th.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. There's almost a sense downtown in New York behind me, down by the World Trade Centers, of just an area completely closed off as the rescue workers try to do their job. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash, and we know that behind that there's an empty piece of what was a very familiar New York skyline, a symbol of the financial prosperity of this city, but completely disappeared now, and New York is still unable to take on board what has happened to them today.
World Trade Center 7 stood 100 yards across from Towers 1 and 2, clear across an entire city block. We see now that World Trade Center 7 is currently under reconstruction, and the new building stands 40 stories tall. In the early afternoon of September 11th, fires broke out in World Trade Center 7. And when we look at the photographs and video available from that day, we see the fires are mostly on the lower floors, and they're largely contained and actually very small. Regardless, at 5:25 p.m., about 7 hours after the first two buildings went down, World Trade Center 7 implodes. And it implodes in a free fall. That's about the speed of gravity. And it does so into its own footprint. And when World Trade Center 7 comes down, it does not damage either of the buildings significantly on either side of it. Now, if you were to ask a structural engineer or a demolition expert about World Trade Center 7, with the facts that have just been presented to you, they would likely not call it a collapse. They would likely call it a work of art. World Trade Center 7 was a controlled demolition.
I understand, I can't prove this, but I've heard that he had just reinsured the building for damages caused by such things as airplanes hitting it or some objects hitting it that had not been in the original contract. Now, I can't prove that, I don't know, but I've heard that.
6 weeks before 9/11, he put an insurance policy on the buildings, which he earned about $5 billion just about in a lawsuit.
That's real money.
That's real money.
Yeah.
He admitted the building was pulled, controlled demolition, and on building and in the film, we actually talked to one of his close friends, one of his security personnel. He didn't want to go on record, so we put him as anonymous, who said Larry Silverstein was on his way to work on 9/11.
You got a call.
And he got a phone call telling him not to show up to work. He put it on speaker, telling him not to show up to work.
Yeah.
Then he called his daughter.
Right.
His daughter worked in Building 7, called his daughter. He told his daughter not to show up to Building 7.
Right.
And him and his daughter both never showed up to work on 9/11.
Yeah.
And what's really funny about Larry Silverstein, he has breakfast in Windows of the Worlds every morning, every day. That's his usual routine. On 9/11, he never showed up there.
Where were you on September 11th?
I was home. And the only reason I wasn't where I was every morning, subsequent to the 26th day of July, my mornings were spent usually at a breakfast meeting at Windows, an 8 o'clock breakfast meeting, Windows, the top of it, and then going down to visit with my tenants, my new tenants, at the Trade Center, getting to know them, understanding their problems and so forth, ascertaining how we could service their needs better, which is one of the first things you do when you acquire a property. You begin to meet your tenants and start talking with them. And so my mornings were spent at the Trade Center, and then by noon I was back uptown, and so that particular morning, because I have light-colored hair and fair skin, and I'm an annuity to the dermatologist. My wife, God bless her, had made an appointment for me at the doctor. And I remember dressing to go to the doctor. I'm finally saying to my wife, I said, sweetheart, I've got so much to do downtown. I got to cancel this. I've got to go downtown. And she said, you're not going to cancel this appointment. You're going to the dermatologist. And, having been married now to the same woman for 46 years, you get this sense of determination on occasion, their voices. And I said, okay, yes, dear, I'll go. I'll go. And then just minutes later, received a telephone call to turn on a television set and witnessed this horrendous circumstance. The first plane hitting, and then the second plane hitting. Of course, with the second hit, it became obvious that this was terrorism. But thereafter was absolute hell because so many of our people were down there. We were in occupancy, temporary occupancy of the 88th floor of the North Tower prior to moving permanently into the 91st floor of the North Tower. And so my children, two of my children, Roger and Lisa, both worked with me. They were on their way to work at 9 o'clock. Many others, about 100 people with us on their way to work. And as it turns out, had the plane struck 15 minutes later, our firm would have been decimated. As it is, we lost 4 of our people, 2 of whom I had hired just a few weeks prior to that. And there are 6 children among them. And it was a horrendous, horrendous experience.
There was another data bit. All of the air defense systems in that part of the country had been turned off that day.
The reason that they didn't know where to go was because a number of conflicting and overlapping war game exercises were taking place.
The National Reconnaissance Office in Chantilly, Virginia, is preparing for an exercise in which a small corporate jet crashes into their building. NORAD is in the middle of a number of military exercises. The first, Vigilant Guardian, is described as an exercise that would pose an imaginary crisis to North American air defense outposts nationwide. The second, Northern Vigilance, moved fighter jets to Canada and Alaska to fight off an imaginary Russian fleet. 3 F-16s from Washington, D.C.'s National Guard at Andrews Air Force Base, 15 miles from the Pentagon, are flown 180 nautical miles away for a training mission in North Carolina. This left 14 fighter jets to protect the entire United States.
They were dealing with as many as 22 possible hijacks on the day of 9/11, and they couldn't separate the war game exercises from the actual hijacks.
Is this real world or exercise? No, this is not exercise manifest.
And they would ask the commissioners, why didn't you deal with the war games? And the commissioners said, oh, well, we were told that was unimportant.
AP learned of the drills because at a Homeland Security function after 9/11, they bragged about it. Oh, we had foresight. We were running drills that very morning. Then senior FAA officials ordered air traffic controllers to shred the tapes from 9/11 in violation of federal law.
The stand-down order was given on 9/11, canceling the military's own standard operating procedures for dealing with hijacked airplanes.
NORAD was founded in 1957, and generals always had the power to shoot down or intercept hijacked aircraft.
Such interceptions usually occur within 10 to 20 minutes after the first sign of trouble. This is a routine procedure happening about 100 times a year. If you've read the story in Popular Mechanics, one of their big lies is, oh, gee, there's only been one such interception in the last several years. No, it's a routine procedure, about 100 times a year.
But on June 1st, 2001, just 3 months before 9/11, Dick Cheney ordered Donald Rumsfeld to allow him to take control of NORAD itself and the shoot-down procedure, and remove that power from the general. Here is a copy of the memorandum from Rumsfeld to the Joint Chiefs, telling them they no longer have any authority.
All of the air defense systems had been turned off. Why? Apparently because the vice president was out in Colorado and he ordered them turned off. Why would you turn off all of the air defense systems on that particular day unless you knew something was going to happen? It's a dot. It's information. But strange that everything got turned off that day. Dot. There was an exercise that was designed for the air defense systems that was an attack on the towers by airplanes. Isn't that strange that we had an exercise that mimicked what really happened? Strange that we had planned an exercise that was exactly what happened. And at the same time, the air defense systems were turned off. Don't you find that strange? I find that weirdly strange. Dot, yeah, just a piece of information. But how does it correlate with everything else? See, so you see the dots. You have all of these dots. They're just bits of information, but that's exactly how the intelligence world works. You get a bit of information here, you get an information here, a bit here, and a bit here, and pretty soon you've got a picture. To me, what does the picture say? Picture says that what we heard and were told in the newspapers, the media, was not the real story. If there's enough doubt in the official story where the stories are absolutely not consistent with what happened, that they paint a different picture than the one that was given to the media, how easy is it for you to shift your belief system from I totally believe in my government to, oh my God, what's going on? And that's exactly where I went in all of this. Because my belief system so strong from age 5 when I can remember, standing on the parade ground at attention, without anybody telling me to do that at West Point. I did it because I wanted to do it, because I believed. And then going to the military academy, serving, defending. The real story was, or I have a question, I guess. The real story to me is, who was the real enemy? Who participated in this? Who planned this attack? Why was it planned? Were the real terrorists the people in Arab clothing? Or were the real people that planned this the people sitting in the authority in the White House?
2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
1 year before 9/11, on September 11th, the year 2000, the neocon organization that called themselves Project for a New American Century, or you may have heard the acronym PNAC or PNAC, actually called in one of their publications for a new Pearl Harbor.
This famous quote is from the Project for New American Century manifesto from page 51. Quote, "The process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor," unquote. As the Project for New American Century manifesto was being published, this offer was made to producer Aaron Russo a full year before 9/11.
I met Rockefeller through a female attorney I knew who called me up one day and said, one of the Rockefellers would like to meet you. I had made a video called Mad as Hell, and he'd seen the video and wanted to meet me and knew I was running for governor of Nevada. So sure, I'd love to meet him. And I met him, and I liked him, and he was a very, very smart man. And we used to talk and share ideas and thoughts. And he's the one who told me 11 months before 9/11 ever happened that there was going to be an event. Never told me what the event was going to be, but there was going to be an event, and out of that event, we were going to invade Afghanistan to run pipelines from the Caspian Sea. We were going to invade Iraq, you know, to take over the oil fields, establish a base in the Middle East, and make it all part of the New World Order. And we'd go after Chavez in Venezuela. And sure enough, later 9/11 happened, and I remember he was telling me how how you're gonna see soldiers looking in caves for people in Afghanistan and Pakistan and all these places, and there's gonna be this war on terror, of which there's no real enemy, and the whole thing is a giant hoax, you know, but it's a way for the government to take over the American people.
He told you it was going to be a hoax.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, there's no question. He says, there's going to be war on terror, and he's just laughing. There's no, who are we fighting? I mean, why do you think 9/11 happened, and then nothing's happened since then? Do you think that our security is so great here that these people who pulled off 9/11, who were able to, can't knock down another plane? Come on, it's ridiculous. 9/11 was done by people in our own government and our own banking system to perpetuate the fear of the American people into subordinating themselves to anything the government wants them to do.
If he joined them, Russo was told, he would, quote, be spared the police state measures, the domestic surveillance state measures, that would be imposed on the rest of the American public. "9/11, in my very educated opinion, was not just an evil inside plot, it was a diabolical inside plot, whose purpose was, in my opinion, to terrorize the United States into putting Israel's interest above our own. I call that treason. To get the United States military into the Middle East, as Nicholas Rockefeller told Russo a year before 9/11. This was a long-time goal of the Project for New American Century U.S. and Israeli Zionists, to effect Israel's goals using American blood and treasure, which is still happening. CENTCOM, which stands for Central Command, the Central Combatant Command of the United States military of the Pentagon, had already, before 9/11, been moved to the Middle East. You would think that CENTCOM would be centered over the United States. Well, one of the reasons for that is, as you have already learned, there was no combatant command over the mainland United States until immediately after 9/11, when they created NORTHCOM for that very purpose.
Reported dual Israeli-U.S. citizen Paul Wolfowitz was Deputy Secretary of Defense, number 2 immediately under Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld.
Richard Pearl, reported dual U.S.-Israeli citizen, proclaimed himself one of the top Project for New American Century Manifesto signatories. He self-proclaimed himself the Prince of Darkness. And he chaired Rumsfeld's Defense Policy Board.
If Richard Pearl is the Prince of Darkness, Dov Zakheim is the king. Dov Zakheim is a rabbi and reported dual U.S.-Israeli citizen. He wrote a paper advocating a staged catastrophic event to force the United States into war to reconfigure the Middle East in Israel's interest, and presented it to the Project for New American Century before they wrote the Project for New American Century Manifesto. And Zakheim is credited with the actual new Pearl Harbor quote in that manifesto. Zakheim headed all of the Pentagon's accounts as its DoD comptroller under Rumsfeld, as the $2.3 trillion was announced being missing the day before 9/11 on September 10th.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
CIA whistleblower Susan Lindauer says it was really $9.1 trillion and that it had gone for Israel. Pentagon auditors tracking the missing money, killed on 9/11 by inside explosives in the Pentagon, and the records were destroyed. Zackheim was the chief executive officer of Systems Planning Corporation, a defense contractor that specialized in remote control of airplanes, especially drone aircraft, used in U.S. military exercises, and a special system which destroyed them in their terminal phases. This is what the evidence shows actually happened at the Pentagon on 9/11. Systems Planning Corporation had a subsidiary that actually oversaw the 1993 World Trade Center 1 attack, so-called investigation, and through that investigation obtained the secret World Trade Center blueprints, which were needed to know where to plant controlled demolition explosives throughout the building. Dov Zackheim arranged for the Pentagon to receive leased converted Boeing 767 fuel tanker planes, which are consistent with what eyewitnesses saw of the plane that actually struck World Trade Center 2 on 9/11. Reported dual Israeli-U.S. citizen Philip Zelikow headed the 9/11 Commission cover-up as its executive director. Reported dual U.S. Israeli citizen Michael Chertoff headed the Department of Justice alleged, quote, investigation, which is a cover-up of 9/11, and became the second new Department of Homeland Security director. So we must ask, whose homeland and whose security? The insider 9/11 plot was the highest evil because it was premeditated. It was based on a Hitlerian scale big lie. We have seen that not just the whole official story of 9/11 is a lie, but every single individual part of it is a lie. The 9/11 plot was designed to kill masses of our innocent fellow citizens. It was designed to falsely blame and demonize Muslims who could not have done it and did not do it. It was created to justify the invasion of their lands in the Middle East for geopolitical power, oil, and Israel's interest. The aggressive 9/11 wars that have killed hundreds of thousands, displaced millions, and cost our country trillions are based entirely on lies and are the highest crime under international law and the Nuremberg Principles, which we wrote as the victors over the Nazis in World War II. So what is the source of this high evil? Incredibly, it is the mentality of Nazism. So who and what are the neocons really? The 9/11 Pentagon neocons, Wolfowitz, Prince of Darkness himself, Richard Pearl, Shalabi, Khalilzad, were all students and are followers of neocon chief philosopher Leo Strauss. They all studied under Professor Strauss at the University of Chicago, and Professor Strauss' ideology is even more extremist than his personal mentor and sponsor in Germany, Hitler's own legal theorist Carl Schmitt. The Schmitt-Strauss doctrine is that the state needs enemies and must create them if necessary, and must fabricate lies for the many, for the people, while its leaders, quote, embrace the darkness, unquote.
We also have to work the dark side, if you will. We're going to spend time in the shadows.
Leo Strauss taught that, quote, those who are fit to rule are those who realize there is no morality and that there is only one so-called natural right, the right of the superior man to rule over the inferior. This is from Leo Strauss and the American Right, a book published about Strauss's so-called philosophy in 1997. Leo Strauss's neocons literally brainstormed the attacks of 9/11 decades before those attacks. Attorney Stanley Hilton studied under Leo Strauss with Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl at the University of Chicago. Hilton's senior thesis under Strauss detailed a plan to establish a presidential dictatorship in the United States using a fabricated Pearl Harbor-like incident as its justification. Stanley Hilton, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Leo Strauss, and others discussed an array of different plots and incidents like September 11th and flying airplanes into buildings way back in the 1960s. And note that the book that Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, passed out hundreds of copies of shortly before the 9/11 attacks was the 1962 book by top neocon Roberto Wolfstetter. The 9/11 neocon's mentor's mentor, therefore, was Hitler's own justifier of evil, Nazi Carl Schmitt. This is a quote from Professor Francis Boyle, an internationally renowned professor of international law at the University of Illinois. Quote, Schmitt was the most notorious Nazi law professor of his day, justifying every atrocity the Nazis inflicted on everyone. We're talking about the Holocaust. We must understand that these so-called neoconservatives are, in fact, neo-Nazis. They espouse the Nazi doctrine of Schmitt and Strauss and Machiavelli and Nietzsche, the doctrine of the Superman, unquote. This is what internationally acclaimed journalist Seymour Hersh had to say. Quote, we, that is the United States, has been taken over basically by a cult. 8 or 9 neoconservatives, we've seen they're really neo-Nazis in their mentality, have somehow grabbed the U.S. government. Just how and why they did it so efficiently, we'll have to wait for much later historians and for better documentation than we have now. But they managed to overcome the federal bureaucracy and the Congress and the press with the greatest of ease. This does say something about how fragile our democracy is, unquote. Lawrence Wilkerson, who was Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell in the Bush-Cheney administration, about this same coup said, it's not a coup, it's worse. This is how retired 4-star U.S. Army General and top NATO commander Wesley Clark put it in a 2003 public address at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco.
What happened in 9/11 is we didn't have a strategy, we didn't have bipartisan agreement, we didn't have American understanding of it, and we had instead a policy coup in this country. A coup. A policy coup. Some hard-nosed people took over the direction of American policy, and they never bothered to inform the rest of us. Then I came back to the Pentagon about 6 weeks later. I saw the same officer. I said, why haven't we attacked Iraq? We still going to attack Iraq? He said, oh, sir. He says, it's worse than that. He said, he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office that says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. I sat on this information for a long time, for about 6 or 8 months. I was so stunned by this I couldn't begin to talk about it. And I couldn't believe it would really be true, but that's actually what happened. These people took control of the policy in the United States. And I realized then, it came back to me, a 1991 meeting I had with Paul Wolfowitz. You know, in 2001 he was Deputy Secretary of Defense, but in 1991 he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It's the number 3 position in the Pentagon. It was a pretty stunning thing. You mean the purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments? It's not to sort of deter conflict? We're going to invade countries? And you know, my mind was spinning. And I put that aside. It was like a nugget that you hold on to. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half-dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control. It went back to those comments in 1991. Now, did anybody ever tell you that? Was there a national dialogue on this? Did senators and congressmen stand up and denounce this plan? Was there a full-fledged American debate on it? Absolutely not. And there still isn't.
The truth is, our government was and still is penetrated and controlled by a Zionist Israeli fifth column that took over the White House, the Congress, the military-civilian superstructure, key military officers and intelligence personnel, and the mainstream media leading up to, on, and after 9/11. The level and extent of this penetration is unprecedented in the history of the world and amounts to a literal invasion by an un-American and hostile force. The same year, 2003, that General Wesley Clark gave that warning that the United States government, civilian superstructure of the military, key military officers and special operators and intelligence personnel had been taken over by an Israeli neocon fifth column coup, Israel's own Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, frustrated that his Middle East destabilization and domination plan wasn't going as well and as quickly as planned, declared that the United States had already conquered Iraq. Remember Bush's famous false and absurd premature mission accomplished speech from the deck of a Navy ship that same year, 2003? Ariel Sharon went on that it was time that the U.S. marched against Libya, Syria, and Iran. Note that President Obama has made Sharon's Libya demand already a reality, that the U.S. is now destabilizing Syria by supporting none other than al-Qaeda-affiliated Syrian so-called rebels, and that the war drums are building now for an attack on Iran. I do not believe it is a coincidence that the same lead actor who played in the movie Pearl Harbor, Ben Affleck, that prepared the ground for the American public to accept the, quote, new Pearl Harbor, unquote, meme for the inside job 9/11 attacks, just happens to be the producer, director, and leading actor of the new movie Argo, a transparent piece of Hollywood CIA propaganda which is intended to demonize Iran and prepare the American public to now accept a war against that final nation in the neocons' quickly falling row of Middle East dominoes.
Dr. Alan Stabrowski, thank you so much for joining us on The Autograph.
My pleasure, Susan.
Tell us how you make the case for Israel's involvement in the tragic 9/11 attacks.
There were several different ways of doing it, Susan, and this may be a little bit more background than some of your people need, but I began to have suspicions about what had happened on 9/11 about 2 weeks after the attacks. There were several discontinuities that made no sense to me whatsoever. The behavior on the part of some of the named terrorists, these 19 Arabs on 4 planes, running around flying schools like loose cannon, not having the pilot skills to fly the aircraft, no recognition for what they had done afterwards in their own area, their own community. And it struck me that for many reasons, none of the arguments that were being given for what they did made any sense. But I then immediately forgot about it until about 2 years ago. And then I came across a video which I found to be extremely disturbing. That video was an interview with a Dutch demolitions expert named Danny Jowenko.
Danny Jowenko heeft er nooit van gehoord. Zijn reactie op de beelden die we laten zien is onbevangen.
Zie je vanaf boven gaan? Nee, je gaat vanaf onder.
Die gaat vanaf onder, ja.
Toch?
Ja.
Ze hebben gewoon kolommen weggeblazen. Er is nagesprongen.
Dit valt anders dan het World Trade Center.
Vind je niet dan?
Ja, je ziet het, de onderste verdiepingen gaan eerst.
Ja, en de rest zakt er gewoon in. Dus dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten?
Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Maar dit is ook op 11 september gebeurd.
Dezelfde dag?
Dezelfde dag.
Dezelfde dag? Weet je dat zeker?
Ja.
Was het zeker weten de 11e? Dat kan heel waar zijn.
7 uur nadat de World Trade Center naar beneden viel.
Ja? Hebben ze hard gewerkt.
You saw that there was effectively no damage to any face of the building. It had not been hit by a plane. It had not been taken major trauma from debris, and it went straight down into its own footprint in about 7 seconds in what was visibly a controlled demolition. You know, and it was pretty clear that whatever those 19 named Arabs on 4 planes, 2 of them at the World Trade Center, had or had not done, they could not have had any possible effect on that 3rd building going down. Shortly after that, I came across, partly out of my own curiosity, which this definitely aroused, and a very extensive video, both of which I've cited, by the way, in some of my recent articles, which were taken on 9/11 itself from what became Ground Zero, the base of World Trade Center 1 and 2, the Twin Towers, involving police, emergency services personnel, newspaper and television correspondents, and you can see and hear secondary explosions at the base of the World Trade Center buildings.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
You gotta get back from here.
Mom,
You know that. You
all
gotta
right.
get back.
All right? Don't worry about me. You need to make calls right now. All right.
Hours after the attack, many smaller explosions rumbled through downtown.
Because once the tower fell, you heard boom, 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 boom.
And we heard this boom, boom, boom.
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
Now, planes impacting at 800 to 1,000 feet above the ground are not going to cause secondary explosions at the ground floor. And this followed over into other reports, also there on September 11th, about vans in the area, white vans. In one case, a van was picked up by police and people arrested at the access to a major bridge. The van was filled with explosives.
And word late tonight that 2 suspects are in FBI custody after a truckload of explosives was discovered around the George Washington Bridge. That bridge links New York to New Jersey over the Hudson River. Whether the discovery of those explosives has anything to do with other events of the day is unclear, but the FBI has 2 suspects in hand, said the truck load of explosives, enough explosives were in the truck to do great damage to the George Washington Bridge. But they arrested the 2 suspects and they're questioning them as we speak.
And the 2 people in it were Israelis. In Bergen, New Jersey, same day, a van with several people in it had set up cameras. Before the first plane hit, they were filming the Twin Towers and they were celebrating. High fives. It was a good thing for them. Residents called police. Police arrested them. All 5 were Israelis.
I grabbed my binoculars and I could see the towers from my window. And this is where I'm looking. And all of a sudden, down there, I see this van parked. And I see 3 guys on top of the van. And I could see that they were like happy. You know, they didn't look shocked to me. You know, they didn't look shocked. I thought it was very strange.
Just happened to see the van and, hollered over to my lieutenant. I think that could be the van. We checked it out and it was. We were all on edge, obviously, so I really wasn't looking to make friends with these people, and neither were the officers that I were with. Once we started talking to them, they were pretty much like, hey, we're not against you, we're with you.
What intrigued me, in addition to angering me, was that within days, all of these reports disappeared from the media. Most Americans don't know that a 3rd building went down at the World Trade Center. Most have never heard about the secondary explosions reported by CNN, ABC, Fox, and others at the foundation of World Trade Center 1 and 2. None have ever heard about the vans. So I began looking at this very carefully, and one of the things that I began looking at was just what would it have taken for a special operations group of any particular nationality to have done 9/11, either by having taken control of the operation we have been told about, of the 19 named Arabs on 4 planes, or having run a parallel operation where you have 4 planes being hijacked, but there is another operation being done with those in concert. And I picked up 3 particular factors that would need to be taken into account. One was motivation, a second was expertise, and the third, the critical one, was access. Now, when it came to motivation, it's probably a very sad commentary on where we are in the world today, that there are an awful lot of countries and groups out there in the world that have either real or contrived reasons to hate America. It wasn't that way when I was a young man, but then many things weren't the same way now as they were when I was a young man. But almost all of the groups and countries that might want to do this only had a negative reason for doing it. They wanted to hurt us. The Israelis had a positive reason, and it's one that a number of their supporters had talked about from the 1990s on up, and what was called the Project for a New American Century, whose members included, by the way, later Vice President Richard Cheney, later Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and many of the so-called neoconservatives, most of them Jewish but not all, who came into the first Bush administration. Israel had a positive reason, and it was get the United States involved in a war in the Middle East with a powerful, enraged, anti-Islamic strain within the American public, that they needed a catalytic event to produce this. They even talked about it in terms of another Pearl Harbor is needed to bring the American people into this fight. The second was expertise. Lots of expertise out there. Bringing buildings down and controlled demolitions is something that almost any intelligence agency of any country in the world can do or can contract. There are many private agencies that do this. But one thing is absolutely clear. Neither those 19 named Arabs on the plane nor Al-Qaeda as an organization had the expertise, the technical expertise to do that. And there is one very clear proof of that. If Al-Qaeda and its affiliates had had the ability to wire even one building for a controlled demolition at the World Trade Center, much less all 3 of them, the so-called green zone in the heart of Baghdad would have been a pile of rubble. And it wasn't. But the last is access. The World Trade Center security was an Israeli-owned company. Security at all 3 of the airports from which the 4 aircraft on 9/11 departed, ICTS, was an Israeli security company. That security company, by the way, also had security at the airports in Paris and Amsterdam later, from which the so-called shoe and underwear bombers departed. The security company at the World Trade Center had 24/7 state-of-the-art electronic surveillance and foot patrols. Wiring a building for a controlled demolition, and I must confess here, this is not my specialty. I have heard what people who do this for a living have said about it, but it is not my specialty. But the description of it in the video of Danny Jawenko that I mentioned to you is a very good one on this, and he described it in which if you needed to do it in a few hours, you would need 30 to 40 people, fewer if you had more time, cutting open the walls, literally cutting open the walls, all the way around the building, implanting the explosives, running detonator cord and cable, wires to put them to a control system, coordinating all of this activity. This is not something that involves the casual bringing in of a briefcase and leaving it at the foot of a building's elevator and going out again. This is extensive work, and it would require the type of extensive sustained access that could not go unremarked by the security forces in place on this. They also needed the ability to evade apprehension and to have their escape concealed. and they had that done. All of the Israelis who were apprehended in those vans were later released in about 2 months at the direction of Michael Chertoff, then the second director of Homeland Security, a dual U.S.-Israeli national. There is no mention of them in the mainstream media, which is largely Zionist-owned. All of the major networks, all of the major national newspapers, all 3 of the weekly news magazines, all of the major political journals, most of the major publishing houses. It simply didn't happen. The only thing that happened on 9/11 that was discussed in the media, that have been accepted by the government, that was described in the 9/11 Commission, are 19 named Arabs on 4 planes bringing down 2 buildings. And the rest of it, in Orwellian terms, has become a non-event and a non-story.
And you know, since you just pointed to the 9/11 Commission report, there is an understanding that the primary motivation for 9/11 was U.S. support for Israel's brutal oppression of the Palestinians, also conveyed in the 9/11 Commission report. I guess my question is, how are these 2 incidents or theories, so to say, related? And, you know, there are those that will brush off your argument as a conspiracy theory. Are you concerned?
I don't think that's so much of a conspiracy theory. I was smiling when you said that, because to tell a bit of a story on this, back in the early 80s, when I was in Washington at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of our visitors for a luncheon talk was a young gentleman then named Francois Heisbourg. Heisbourg was the special assistant to French President Francois Mitterrand. And I don't know how the subject came up, but he said, you know, Americans never see conspiracies anywhere. We French, he said, we see conspiracies everywhere. And both of us are wrong. This is not a conspiracy in the sense that it is usually used, the word is usually used, which is to denigrate an opposing argument. When someone in the United States says that that's a conspiracy or that's a conspiracy theory, by definition they mean it is irrational, illegitimate, and without proof. All I would suggest to people is that you look at the films of WTC-7, that 3rd tower going down on September 11th. You look and listen to the reports on September 11th with the secondary explosions. These are not fantasies. They happened. You look at the reports on September 12th of the apprehension of Israelis with vans of explosives and cameras filming the events on September 11. These are not fantasies. And you look at the people riddling the American government, all of the Middle East people in State Defense and the National Security Council, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Douglas Feith, who used to be a friend of mine, by the way, from Philadelphia. These people were all part of the neoconservative movement. Many of these people are dual U.S.-Israeli nationals. All of their primary allegiance is to Israel.
It has been more than 16 years since a civilian working for the Navy was charged with passing secrets to Israel. Jonathan Pollard pled guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage and is serving a life sentence. At first, Israeli leaders claimed Pollard was part of a rogue operation, but later took responsibility for his work. Now, Fox News has learned some U.S. investigators believe that there are Israelis again very much engaged in spying in and on the U.S., who may have known things they didn't tell us before September 11th. Fox News correspondent Carl Cameron has details in the first of a 4-part series.
Since September 11th, more than 60 Israelis have been arrested or detained, either under the new Patriot anti-terrorism law or for immigration violations. A handful of active Israeli military were among those detained, according to investigators, who say some of the detainees also failed polygraph questions when asked about alleged surveillance activities against and in the United States. There is no indication that the Israelis were involved in the 9/11 attacks, but investigators suspect that the Israelis may have gathered intelligence about the attacks in advance and not shared it. A highly placed investigator said there are, quote, tie-ins, but when asked for details, he flatly refused to describe them, saying, quote, evidence linking these Israelis to 9/11 is classified. I cannot tell you about evidence that has been gathered. It's classified information. Fox News has learned that one group of Israelis, spotted in North Carolina recently, is suspected of keeping an apartment in California to spy on a group of Arabs who the United States is also investigating for links to terrorism. Numerous classified documents obtained by Fox News indicate that even prior to September 11th, as many as 140 other Israelis had been detained or arrested in a secretive and sprawling investigation into suspected espionage by Israelis in the United States. Investigators from numerous government agencies are part of a working group that's been compiling evidence since the mid-90s. These documents detail hundreds of incidents in cities and towns across the country that investigators say, quote, may well be an organized intelligence gathering activity. The first part of the investigation focuses on Israelis who say they are art students from the University of Jerusalem and Bezalel Academy. They repeatedly made contact with U.S. government personnel, the report says, by saying they wanted to sell cheap art or handiwork. Documents say they, quote, targeted and penetrated military bases, the DEA, FBI, and dozens of other government facilities, and even secret offices and unlisted private homes of law enforcement and intelligence personnel. The majority of those questioned, quote, stated they served in military intelligence, electronic surveillance intercept, and/or explosive ordnance units. Another part of the investigation has resulted in the detention and arrests of dozens of Israelis at American Mall kiosks, where they've been selling toys called Puzzle Car and Zoomcopter. Investigators suspect a front. Shortly after the New York Times and Washington Post reported the Israeli detentions last month, the carts began vanishing. Zoomcopter's webpage says, we are aware of the situation caused by thousands of mall carts being closed at the last minute. This in no way reflects the quality of the toy or its saleability. The problem lies in the operator's business policies. Why would Israelis spy in and on the U.S.? A General Accounting Office investigation referred to Israel as Country A and said, quote, according to a U.S. intelligence agency, the government of Country A conducts the most aggressive espionage operation against the U.S. of any U.S. ally. A defense intelligence report said Israel has a voracious appetite for information and, quote, the Israelis are motivated by strong survival instincts which dictate every facet of their political and economic policies. It aggressively collects military and industrial technology, and the U.S. is a high priority target. The document concludes, quote, Israel possesses the resources and technical capability to achieve its collection objectives.
A spokesman for the the Israeli embassy here in Washington issued a categorical denial, saying any suggestion that Israelis are spying in or on the U.S. is, quote, simply not true. There are other things to consider, and in the days ahead, we will take a look at the U.S. phone system and law enforcement's methods for wiretaps, and an investigation into the possibility that both have been compromised by our friends and allies overseas. Brett?
Carl, what about this question of advanced knowledge of what was going to happen on 9/11? How clear are investigators that some Israeli agents may have known something?
Well, it's very explosive information, obviously, and there's a great deal of evidence that they say they have collected, none of it necessarily conclusive. It's more when they put it all together. A bigger question, they say, is how could they not have known? Almost a direct quote, Brett.
This going to the fact that they were spying on some Arabs, right?
Correct.
All right, Carl, thanks very much.
In a recent article, Zabrowski explains why he is anti-Israeli. He notes, because of what it has done to the U.S. in the furtherance of its own goals. The USS Liberty incident and 9/11 obviously stand out. And because of the leverage it has acquired over the U.S. government and its policies through the machinations of the domestic Jewish community here.
My concern is that I don't much care about other people or other countries. I don't hate anyone in particular. I don't like anyone in particular. I'm an American. My loyalty is strictly to the United States. And I don't care what my ethnicity is or what my ancestry is. My allegiance is that. And my concern is only whether something helps or hurts the United States. And I think anyone who's a citizen of any country can very properly have similar feelings toward their country. What I'm concerned about is what is done to hurt America. And it is very clear that over a period of the last 40-odd years, that the penetration of the American political process, the effective subordination of the Congress in particular to Israel, when an Israeli prime minister can get 29 standing ovations from a Congress that can't give that much support to one of their own presidents, no matter how outlandish the statements, you have something as close to a puppet agency as you're going to find. Our policy in the Middle East has for decades been manipulated increasingly in terms of what benefits Israel and not what benefits the United States, even when that policy is articulated and supported by individuals who are sworn officials of the United States government. And to me, when a sworn official of the United States government, whether or not that person has dual Israeli citizenship, manipulates American policy, contrives crises and tragedies like 9/11, contrives wars like Afghanistan and Iraq, and now tries to get us into a war with Iran, all in the service of Israel, spending American lives in that process, they commit high treason. And they need to be treated in that manner.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all. That unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. If the press is awaiting a declaration of war before it imposes the self-discipline of combat conditions, then I can only say that no war ever posed a greater threat to our security. If you are awaiting a finding of clear and present danger, then I can only say that the danger has never been more clear, and its presence has never been more imminent. It requires a change in outlook, a change in tactics, a change in missions by the government, by the people, by every businessman or labor leader, and by every newspaper. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence. on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed.